Joining us, Republican Congressman Ed Royce. He's the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Also joining us, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff. He's the ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us. Chairman Royce, let me start with you. Your assessment of what Russia is up to in Syria right now. You heard Senator McCain say the Russian strikes are targeting CIA-backed rebels who are opposed to the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. Your assessment?
General Soleimani of the Quds forces, the Iranian force in charge of assassinations and attacks outside of Iran, carries out the activities in Syria. And you'll notice General Soleimani made that trip to Moscow, had that meeting with President Putin, and asked if Russia would come in, apparently, and assist the Quds forces, the Iranians, in their support on the ground for Assad. The concern I have in all of this is that so far, most of Assad's attacks, 90% of his attacks over the last month, have been against the Sunni population, the majority population in Syria. So those have primarily been attacks on markets, on schools, on hospitals. 10% have been on his opposition. Unfortunately, this first wave of attacks by the Russians did hit markets, a bakery, and so the question is it more attacks just on the Sunni population, or are they actually going to go after the foreign fighters in ISIS? That's the big question here.
What is your assessment, Congressman Schiff?
Well, my assessment is that what Russia is doing by not targeting ISIL in this first wave of strikes is really playing into Assad's strategy, combining with Assad's strategy, and that is going after the moderate opposition, making this what Bashar al-Assad wanted to be, a self-fulfilling prophecy all along, a choice between Assad ultimately and also ISIL and al-Qaeda. And the way to do that for Assad has been focusing his firepower on the moderates, and now the Russians are coming in doing the same thing. Well, I think it explains one question we had yesterday, which is, why weren't the Russians working with us to deconflict? And I think the answer now is quite clear. They didn't work with us to deconflict because they would have come in and said, here's where we're going to bomb, and we would have said, but there's no ISIL there, and they would have had to explain that's not really what we're after.
Reuters is reporting, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be precise, hundreds of Iranian troops have now arrived in Syria. They're joining forces with Lebanese Hezbollah forces, all of whom back the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. They're going after these CIA-backed, these U.S.-backed rebels, in effect, on the ground, whereas the Russians are going after them from the air. What can you tell us about this, if this is happening?
Yes, this is part of the coalition which Iran has with Russia and with Assad in Syria. And the great humanitarian disaster that's occurring as a result is that as these Shia militia, they're all Shia, or the Alawites are allied with the Shia, as they press their war against the wider Sunni majority and against coalition-supported forces there, what is happening is that 7 million Syrians have been displaced. Now, these are primarily Sunnis. Part of it has been displaced by ISIS, it's true, but most of it has been displaced by Assad's forces, by the Hezbollah militia, which assist them, by the IRGC Iranian forces that assist them, and the Quds forces. And so this is a humanitarian nightmare in the region and beyond the region now for Europe, as populations are fleeing as a consequence of these attacks, many of them focused on civilian centers. Chemical attacks at night, by the way, by Assad, and barrel bombs during the day. And so this is a humanitarian nightmare in the region.
How concerned, Congressman Schiff, are you about this alleged or this reported intelligence cooperation, intelligence sharing deal that the Russians apparently have worked out with Iran, Iraq, and Syria?
Well, I'm particularly concerned about the Iran connection. Certainly, I don't think they're going to be very helpful in Iraq either. But this connection between Iran, Hezbollah, and now Russia, I think is a reflection of the fact that there was a growing concern in Tehran and in Moscow that the regime was cracking and might crumble. So this is an effort, a last-ditch effort to really escalate in the hopes of saving leaving the regime. And the consequence, I think, is going to be that the conflict is merely prolonged, because as long as Assad is in power, this civil war is going to churn on. And as my colleague, Chairman Royce, is saying, it's a humanitarian disaster, the likes of which we haven't seen probably since World War II. And anything that's going to prolong it is just an agony. So I have deep concerns about it. I'll make one other point, Wolf. I think the last time we talked, it was about the Turks and how they were joining the coalition but bombing the Kurds. And I think we're seeing the same thing here. The Turks were saying, okay, we're joining the coalition against ISIL, but using that as a pretext to go into the Kurds. I think the Russians are now doing the same thing, saying we're joining the coalition against ISIL, but we're really going after the modern opposition, the only real threat to the regime of Assad.
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me pick up on that. Based on what you know, has the U.S. started directly providing weapons to the Kurds, who, as you know, are fierce fighters and who work with the U.S., but they've been complaining that they're not getting the equipment they need to fight ISIS and other groups?
No, the U.S. policy is not to do that. We're waiting support from Baghdad, and of course the Shia majority in Baghdad, under pressure from Iran, is blocking the support of the mortars, of the artillery, of the anti-tank weapons that the Kurds need. So the Kurds are strung out right now over a 600-mile front. 30% of their forces are women, about 180,000 Kurdish Peshmerga forces, and they're holding back ISIS, and many of the minorities, the Yazidis and others, Christians, are fleeing behind Kurdish lines. But as they tell us, as their foreign minister, who's been here on 3 occasions to tell us, they're out of ammunition, they don't have mortar shells, they don't have the equipment, and so for them to push back ISIS, they need that kind of support directly from the United States. They're not going to get it from an Iranian-influenced government in Baghdad, and so far the administration has not moved forward with that direct support. Although we have tried to move legislation to do it, but they have indicated they would veto that legislation.
Let me get both of you quickly to respond. We're almost out of time, to what the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, just told the United Nations General Assembly. He was very, very firm, fiery speech, obviously bitterly complaining about the Iran nuclear deal. And among other things, he said this.
Does anyone seriously believe that flooding a radical theocracy with weapons and cash will curb its appetite for aggression? Do any of you really believe that a theocratic Iran with sharper claws and sharper fangs will be more likely to change its stripes?
All right, Congressman Schiff, you voted for the Iran nuclear deal. How worried are you that with tens of billions of dollars about to flow into Iran, as the Prime Minister said, they're going to use that money to promote terror attacks against Israel and others?
Well, I'm certainly very concerned about it, and I think unquestionably some of the additional resources Iran has, it's going to devote to a lot of the people we're fighting against, like Hezbollah. At the same time, while I would be concerned and am concerned with Iran that's better resourced, I'd be frankly even more concerned with an Iran with a runaway nuclear program, which is what they had before the agreement, when they had 20,000 centrifuges spinning and about 12,000 kilos of enriched uranium. So rolling back their nuclear program, depriving them of the nuclear club where they could threaten Israel, that to me is the most significant objective in the agreement.
Chairman Royce, you oppose the nuclear deal. Your reaction to what the Prime Minister of Israel just said?
Well, I think the fact that the Russians are transferring $20 billion worth of combat aircraft into Iran, you know, when that $100 billion is released out of escrow, the fact that $20 billion of it will pay for that Russian combat aircraft and other equipment, as well as the $100 million that they're transferring to Hezbollah, they are specifically